It is my pleasure to welcome you. It's organized by Office of International Affairs at 경희sa이버대 University. My name is Jin-hee Kim. I'm a professor of Department of American Studies and at the same time director of Office of International Affairs. So today we are lucky to have such a renowned scholar as Professor Mustafa Bayoumi. He is currently a professor of City University of New York, and he also is currently teaching at Seogang University for one semester. And he had his PhD in Columbia University, majoring English and comparative literature, and he is also a co-editor of the Edward Said Widow. I'm not quite sure whether students know Edward Said. He is really famous and very influential scholar. He passed away a couple of years ago, right? And Professor Bayoumi was his student. And Professor Bayoumi also published academic essays in various journals, including the Yale Journal of Criticism, Americia, the Journal of Asian American Studies, to name but a few. And especially Professor Bayoumi wrote a book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? And this book was highly acclaimed in various book reviews and received the American Book Award in 2008 and Arab American Award in 2009. So this is about young Arab Americans after 9/11. And today's talk is based on his book. So please welcome Professor Bayoumi.
Thank you all for coming. I also want to express my thanks to Professor Jin-hee Kim and to Kyunghee University. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you today. And I'm going to talk to you today about my book, as Professor Kim was mentioning. My book is called How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America. And I'll tell you as I get into the discussion, as I get into my paper that I'm going to read to you, I will tell you where that title actually comes from. Like every good scholar, I actually stole the title. And I start off my paper just to give you a little bit of background. Okay, the paper begins with me telling a little story of a man named Sadi. So that's an Arabic name for a man, Sadi. And Sadi actually means someone who's joyful, if you want the translation. I'm beginning the discussion of the paper with Sadi, and he's sitting with his friends in a cafe, but it's called a hookah cafe. Anybody know what a hookah is?
Kind of cigarette?
Yes, exactly. It's a kind of cigarette, like those water pipes. You've seen those big water pipes where people smoke. Maybe you've seen them in the movies or in Itaewon. They probably have them in Itaewon. They have everything in Itaewon. And so that's what the hookah cafe is. And these are actually very common and very popular with young Arab guys in Brooklyn, New York. And after September 11, the hookah cafes also became very popular, not just for the Arabs, but also for a lot of people just in general. It became a kind of fashionable thing to do in New York City, as it did in France and other places. So we can also talk about culture and things like that after I discuss the paper. Anyways, let me get to the book. How does it feel to be a problem, being young and Arab in America? Sadi and 4 of his 20-something friends are at a hookah cafe, almost underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in Brooklyn. It's lit, but the summer heat is strong and hangs in the air. They sit on the sidewalk in a circle, water pipes bubbling between their white plastic chairs. Sadi is upset. He recently found out that his close friend of almost 4 years was an undercover police detective sent to spy on him and his friends and his community. Even the guy's name, Camille Pasha, was fake, which particularly bothered the 24-year-old Palestinian American, Sadi. After appearing as a surprise witness at a recent terrorism trial in Brooklyn, Pasha vanished. And that's when Saadi discovered the truth, that he was a police lieutenant. I was very hurt, he says. Was it friendship, or was he doing his job? He takes a puff from his water pipe. I felt betrayed. The smoke comes out thick and smells like apples. How could I not have seen this, he tells me. The guy had 4 bank accounts. He was always asking for a receipt wherever he went. He had an empty apartment, a treadmill, a TV, and a mattress. That's it. No food, no wardrobe. He shakes his head. We were stupid not to figure it out, he says. You have to know the family, Saadi tells me, and he points to those around the circle. His mother's my aunt. I've known him since I was in 2nd grade. I know where his family lives, and he's also my cousin. He says, ticking off each person in turn. Then he gets to me. You, I'm not so sure about, he says, and all the young men laugh loudly. Informants and spies are regular conversation topics in the age of terror, a time when friendships are tested, trust disappears, and tragedy becomes comedy. If questioning friendship is not enough, Saadi also had other problems. He was fired from his Wall Street job, and he's convinced that the firing was because of his birthplace in Jerusalem. Anti-Arab feelings and anti-Muslim feelings were routinely taught to him at his workplace. And he's now happier anyways at a technology company staffed by other ethnic Americans. But the last several years have taken their toll. I asked Saadi about life after September 11 for Arab Americans. We're the new blacks, he says. You know that, right? How does it feel to be a problem? Just over a century ago, W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois asked that very question in his American classic book, The Souls of Black Folk. That's where I stole that from. And he offered an answer, Du Bois. Being a problem is a strange experience, he wrote, peculiar even. No doubt evoking the peculiar institution of slavery. Du Bois composed his book during a time of official racial segregation that deliberately kept away from the wider world the human details of African American life. White people and African Americans couldn't know each other during that period. Determined to pull back the veil separating populations, Du Bois showed his readers a fuller picture of the black experience, including, quote, the meaning of its religion, the black experience's religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls. A century later, Arab and Muslim Americans are the new problem of American society. But there have, of course, been others. Native Americans were called merciless Indian savages by the Declaration of Independence, and they were said to be beyond civilization and able to understand only the language of force. With the rise of Catholic immigration to the country in the 19th century, Irish and Italian Americans were attacked for their religion. There's a long history of anti-Catholic feeling in the United States. They suffered mob violence and frequent accusations of being loyal to the Pope above being loyal to the country. During World War I, German Americans were hated. Sauerkraut, you know that German food, sauerkraut, that gets put on hot dogs sometimes? Sauerkraut was called Liberty Cabbage during World War I. They didn't want to call it sauerkraut anymore. And several states banned the teaching of German, convinced that the language itself would promote un-American values in World War I. Between the world wars, anti-Semitism drove Jewish Americans out of universities and jobs and fueled these wild conspiracy theories concerning warfare and world domination. Japanese Americans were herded like cattle into internment camps during World War II. Chinese Americans were commonly suspected of harboring communist sympathies during the McCarthy era, right? Frequently losing jobs as a result. And Hispanic Americans have long been seen as outsider threats to American culture, even though their presence in the United States is older than the formation of the United States itself. But ever since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Arabs and Muslims, two groups that were virtually unknown to most Americans before September 11, now hold the dubious distinction of being the first new communities of suspicion after the hard-won victories of the civil rights era. Even if prejudice continues to persist in American society, the American creed for fairness was now supposed to mean that we ought to be judged not by our religion, or our gender, or our color, or our country of origin, but simply by the content of our individual character. The terrorist attacks, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the explosion of political violence around the world have put that dream in jeopardy for American Arabs and Muslims. In the eyes of some Americans, they have become collectively known as dangerous outsiders. Bias crimes against Arab Muslims and those assumed to be Arab or Muslim spiked 1,700% in the first 6 months after September 11, and then have never since returned to their pre-2001 levels. A USA Today Gallup poll, so this is a poll from 2006, showed that 39% of Americans, almost 40%, admit to holding prejudice against Muslims, and believe that Muslims, US citizens included, should carry special identification cards. Right? And that's just the number who admit to that. So you can imagine the number must be higher. In fact, the most recently published poll was about a year ago, was performed by the Washington Post and the CBS News Corporation, and they found that 48% of Americans hold negative opinions about Islam and Muslims. So the numbers are actually going up. It didn't just spike in 2001 and then go down. It's continuing to go up. In fact, different studies from the universities of Illinois at Chicago, from Harvard University, and from Purdue University have each found out that the more positively one feels about the United States, the more likely one is to have anti-Arab feelings. So in other words, hostility remains high. I can give you another poll, another indication. In 2007, there was another poll, and they asked people asked parents, who would they want their children not to marry? And 40% of parents said they don't want their children to marry a Muslim. It was the highest number of anybody. Only atheists came close. Now, government policies certainly have not helped this situation. Mass arrests happened following the attacks, and these increased general suspicion of Arabs and Muslims in the country. So right after the attacks, the government arrested thousands of people and rounded them up and then eventually deported almost all of them. The government demanded non-immigrant males also from 24 Muslim majority countries register their whereabouts in the United States, leading to deportation proceedings against almost 14,000 people. And racial profiling, almost universally hated before 2001, assumed a new life in 2003 when then President Bush, ordered a ban on racial profiling, but included an exception. His exception was permitting the use of race and ethnicity to combat potential terrorist attacks. So you can still use race and ethnicity against terrorism. While it could now be said that profiling other groups was officially and legally un-American, profiling Arabs and Muslims made good national security sense. But what exactly is a profile? It's a sketch in charcoal, a profile. It's the simplified contours of a face, a silhouette in black and white, a textbook description of a personality. By definition, a profile draws an incomplete picture. It substitutes recognition for detail. It's what an outsider from the street observes when looking through the window pane of somebody else's life. Profiling Arabs and Muslims has in reality expanded far beyond law enforcement, far beyond the police. Arab and Muslim Americans are now routinely profiled in their places of employment, in their jobs, in housing, for public opinion polls, and in the media. And yet they still remain curiously unknown. Most Americans have no idea who Arabs and Muslim Americans are, even though there's all this attention paid to them. Broadly speaking, the representations that we do tend to see fall into two types. Either the exceptional, assimilated immigrant, or the violent fundamentalist. On TV, you only see those two. You only see somebody who's a violent fundamentalist or really, really American. Like extremely American, exaggerated American. Nothing in between. Nothing, in other words, of real life, right? The questions they are asked in the media and in real life constantly circle simplistically around the same frames of reference: terrorism, women, and assimilation. Questions that may be understandable in the age frequently overlook the complex human dimensions of Muslim American or Arab American life. Terms such as moderate and radical are used so freely as to mean next to nothing. And cliched phrases like sleeper cell, alienated Muslims, radicalization, and homegrown terrorists degrade the language to the point that they structure the ways we even think about the Muslims living amongst us. It seems barely an exaggeration to say that Arab and Muslim Americans are constantly talked about in the American media, but are almost never heard from. The problem is not that they lack representations, but that they have too many. And they are all abstractions. Arabs and Muslims have become a foreign policy issue, an argument on the domestic agenda, a police priority, a point of well-meaning concern, all kinds of things. They appear as shadowy characters on television shows. They have become objects of sociological inquiry. They get paraded around as puppets for public diplomacy. Pop culture is awash with their images. Hookah cafes entice East Village hipsters. Fashionistas appropriate the checkered keffiyeh scarf. You've seen that scarf that a lot of Arabs wear now. It's become a very fashionable thing to wear. And Prince, you know the musician Prince. Prince even has a song that's an ode to a young Arab American girl called Cinnamon Girl. They are floating everywhere. Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are floating everywhere in the virtual landscape of the national imagination, either as villains of Islam or as victims of Arab culture. Yet, like the postmodern world in which we live, sometimes when you are everywhere, you are really nowhere. Frankly, it's exhausting. It's like living on a treadmill. University of Michigan anthropologists Sally Howell and Andrew Shryock succinctly describe the situation when they write, this is a quote, "In the aftermath of September 11, Arab and Muslim Americans have been compelled, time and again, to apologize for acts they did not commit, to condemn acts they never condoned, and to openly profess loyalties that for most U.S. citizens are merely assumed." And yet, despite the apologies, the condemnations, and the professions, still their voices are not heard. And while so many terrible things have happened in the past years, plenty of good things have also occurred. Many Japanese American groups are now speaking out against today's wartime policies and making alliances with a lot of Arab American and Muslim American groups because they're making the connection between the histories. That's a good thing, I think. There's been an extraordinary outgrowth in interfaith dialogues between different religious organizations. That's also a good thing. And much of this happens quietly in church basements, in mosques holding open houses, in Jewish community centers, or in university or community halls. But such events too often are obscured, drowned out by the ideology of our age. Yet what remains in the shadows today, what we don't see really, are the human dimensions as to how Arabs and Muslims live their lives, the rhythms of their works and days, the varieties of their religious experiences, the obstacles they face, and the efforts they shoulder to overcome them. In other words, what is absent is how they understand the meaning of their religion, the passion of their sorrow, and the struggle of their souls. But in today's landscape, none of that seems to matter. One could say that in the dawning years of the 21st century, when Arabs are the new chic and Islam is all the rage, Muslims and Arabs have essentially become a nagging problem to solve one way or another. And being a problem is a strange experience. Frustrating, even. So I decided to write a book to help me with my frustrations. But the book that I wrote is not about me. It's about the generation behind me, 20-something Arab Americans who since 2001 have had to navigate this world somewhere between expectation and frustration. I know what it's like to be an Arab and a Muslim today. But what is it like, I wondered, to be young Arab and Muslim in the age of terror? So I began exploring this question in early 2005, spending my time with Brooklyn's Arab American youth to find out the stories which would reveal something about their human dimensions, about their Arab American experience, and about the political truths of our age. I decided early on that stories, long and richly told, would be at the heart of my book, in an attempt, you could say, to humanize a population that was being increasingly dehumanized, and had to deal with this slow withdrawal of their humanity on the national and the media stages. In my attempt to bring together narrative and politics, I was, I suppose, interested in the most basic political function of narrative, namely trying to bring life into a story, right? Trying to make us understand somebody else's life, the empathetic role that telling a story can have. That being said, the main character in my book is youth. It's young people. To be young is to be at a crossroads in life. It is a time to discover who you are, what values you hold, and which friendships you will cherish. That's true for everybody. This is true for all young people. But for young Arab Americans today, to be young is also more complicated. For it means that you are also living a paradox. On the one hand, the older generation looks hopefully to you with the belief that you will produce a better world for yourself, your family, your community, and your country. On the other hand, the culture at large increasingly looks at you with mounting levels of fear, aversion, and sometimes outright hostility. Today's young Arab Americans live uncomfortably between these two different expectations. Moreover, there are many of them. Like most immigrant populations in the United States, both Arab and Muslim Americans are younger than the general population. Right? And Arab and Muslim, by the way, are two different but overlapping categories. Right? Do you remember in high school, did you do Venn diagrams? You know those circles and then how they can overlap and you look at yeah. So think of Arab and Muslim like that. So not every Arab is Muslim and not every Muslim is Arab, but there is this overlapping area there. Right? In fact, the largest number of Muslims in the United States are African American, not Arab. And then after African American, they're probably South Asian. They're Indian, Pakistani, from that part of the world. And then actually come the Arab Americans. And most Arab Americans in the United States are Christians due to the immigration history from the Arab region. Only about 25% of Arab Americans today are Muslim. So I'm talking about that, the overlapping circle part of the Venn diagram. So, moreover, there are many of them. Like most immigrant populations, both Arab and Muslim Americans are younger than the general population. 21% of the American public in general is between 18 and 30 years of age. 21%. But 30% of American Muslims are. The median age of Arab Americans is 31 compared to 35 for the whole of the United States. So both Arabs and Muslims are younger than the general average. This also means that many young Arabs and Muslims have no adult experience of the world prior to September 11th. And while nationally, Arabs and Muslims are generally richer than average Americans, in Brooklyn, many come from working class backgrounds, where they are driving their way through the maze of the American dream on paths that have become more complicated for those who are young, Arab, and Muslim. They are often anxious about their futures, and their anxieties reveal much, not only about their own personalities, but also about the tensions in contemporary American society. If youth is the central character, then Brooklyn is the setting in this book. Abstractions thrive when people are removed from their contexts, but grounding a story in one place has allowed me to explore the concrete details of lived experience within a single geography. So the book that I did end up writing, all of the stories are of young Arab Americans from Brooklyn, New York, all just from one place, right? And I thought that if I just focused on one place, we could really understand what life is about, rather than just picking and choosing from all these different places. My reasons for choosing Brooklyn are multiple. Besides its proximity to what is known as Ground Zero, Brooklyn has the largest Arab American population in the nation. According to the 2000 census, close to 36,000 live in Brooklyn, about half of New York City's total Arab American population. So that's one reason. And another reason to choose Brooklyn is because Brooklyn is a place that is very, very diverse. Right? There's a lot of people from all over the whole world in Brooklyn. It's not like there's only white people and Arab Americans, for example. Right? So that makes, to my mind, it makes Brooklyn, in a way, the future of the United States. Because it's a place where everybody has to learn how to get along, and no one group is dominant. Right? So that's another reason, I think, to choose Brooklyn. And I like that about Brooklyn. I like to think of Brooklyn as being, in a way, the best of the United States. Brooklyn is like the United States without its foreign policy, you could say. Unless if you consider what Brooklyn thinks about Queens' foreign policy. That's another question. So after deciding on the setting, I began asking friends what stories they knew about contemporary Arab American life. And those friends were soon asking their friends on my behalf, etc., etc., etc. I talked to community leaders, and I introduced myself to imams, local religious leaders, at the Islamic centers. Although my own background is both Arab and Muslim, I don't live in Bay Ridge, the neighborhood in Brooklyn with the highest concentration of Arab Americans. And most of my Arab and Muslim friends and associates before this project were older and came from the academic world. I was, in other words, both an insider and an outsider to this community. Since Muslim communities around the country now often feel like they are, being patrolled, they often are suspicious of outsiders coming in, I was concerned that those I spoke to might be worried of who I am, of my interest. But my own worries were quickly set aside. One Friday after prayer, for example, I went to a Friday prayer. The main congregational prayer for Muslims is on Friday afternoon. And Christians have it on Sunday mornings. For Muslims, it's on Friday afternoon. So I would go to one of these mosques and I would talk to one of the imams, a local religious leader, right, the imam. And I would ask him to help me. And I became friends with this imam, and at one point I was talking to him after the prayer, and he saw me, and he said, I was there after the prayer, and he saw me, and he said, come wait in my office, I want to talk to you. And he had other people to talk to first. So I go up to his office, and I'm thinking, uh-oh. Either this is really good, he's going to tell me something I really want to know, or this is really bad, and he's going to tell me that he doesn't trust me, and he doesn't want me around the community anymore. So I was sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, and then finally, he arrived. And he sits right down, and he opens his desk, and he has a drawer in his desk, pulls it out, has a black book in his hand, flips through the book, and he says, so Mustafa, she's 30 years old, and has a master's degree in chemistry from Denmark, and she's Egyptian. Do you want to meet her? So he's trying to marry me off. He's trying to, play matchmaker, right? So at that point, I figured, okay, I think they're not suspicious of me if they're trying to marry me off into the community. So I said, no, thank you very much, but it's fine, thank you. And then he said to me, hey, Mustafa, Mustafa, هي حلوة زي بسبوسة. Arabic. He said, why not Mustafa? She's beautiful, like a sweet honey cake. But I said, no, thank you. So before long, my efforts were paying off, even if the imams didn't. I started to hear stories. People were calling me, letting me know, and I had gained enough confidence with the community that I was interested in getting to know, that in fact the community asked me or invited me to attend a closed-door meeting that they had between community leaders and the FBI. Right? At one point, the FBI was going around. I think they still do this. But the FBI goes around to the different communities that are implicated in the war on terror, and they want to have these like community meetings with the leaders of the community. And they're not open meetings; these are just between the FBI and the community leaders. So one of the community leaders said to me, "Do you want to come?" I said, "Yes, I want to come." So I came along to this meeting. It was really interesting. First of all, these were the first people from the FBI that I had ever met, right? And you know what? They look just like they do in the movies. They all are like, all these white guys, like, you know, tall, big built, right? And they have these like military type haircuts, and they look you straight in the eye, they shake your hand, "Hi Mustafa, how are you?" Right? They squeeze your hand real tough, right? Except for like, there's a whole group of them, all like that, except for one Moroccan agent who was dressed in brown for some reason. All the rest of them were dressed in blue. I don't know. And then the meeting was such a strange meeting. It was actually, to my mind, it was a failure in all kinds of ways. But it was interesting. The meeting was held in this place called the Muslim Community Center in Brooklyn. And so it used to be this old Italian banquet hall. So you have this huge chandelier in the middle of the room and these mirrors across the whole room, and everything looks really fancy, right? And so then you just have these basic desks that are out. They had made this big square. So the FBI comes in. First, all these police come in first to make sure that everything's all clear. Then the police leave and the FBI come in. And then the FBI's main man for New York City counterterrorism was coming to this meeting. So the security was even higher, right? His name was Mark Mershon. And so they all come to the meeting, and then we make our, hellos and everything, and everyone sits down. And there's a big square out of the tables. So FBI is sitting all on one side, and the community leaders are on the other side. But we're far away from each other. So then the community leaders are talking to each other in Arabic. They say, "Why are we so far away? We should be closer to them." "Yes, we should, of course, let's be closer to them." So they stand up, and they start taking the tables away and moving closer. But of course, the FBI does not understand Arabic, so they're just looking like, what's going on? What's going on? Right? And then the meeting begins, and I'll tell you a little bit about it here. It was, to my mind, strange. For one thing, here you have the FBI. Of course, to me, they look like they came out of the movies. But to them, we probably look like we came out of the movies, right? The community leaders. Here we are, all brown-skinned, we have like accents when we speak. The religious leader who was with us, he's all dressed up in his religious garb, So it was this weird like movie scene almost. But of course, if you ever watch the movies, you know that we're the bad guys. So the meeting lasted for 3 hours. And this 3-hour meeting was an example of the failed communication, I feel, that marks our age. Seemingly unaware of the irony in their statements, the FBI told the community leaders, a group of successful physicians and businessmen who had already given much to multicultural America, that the FBI wanted, quote, to bring the Arab Muslim community to this melting pot country and instill a sense of love for our precious freedoms. So they're patronizing to the community, right? They demanded that the community leaders condemn terrorism in front of them, which they willingly did. Meanwhile, the community leaders wanted to talk about other issues, like how government closures of several national charities had led to a crisis in charitable giving, and how government surveillance was scaring people away from the community and community activities, these spies. They wanted to know how to get off the no-fly list, for example. There's this big no-fly list, and if you have a name, it's probably not is probably similar to Korean names. You know, Arabic names, there's not that much variety, right? How many Kims are there in this room right now, right? So it's easy to have the same name as somebody else. So the no-fly list can really just be a real problem for a lot of people who have the same name. To these questions, the FBI had little to add. Our only answer is to get to the airport early, they said about the no-fly list. Everyone was polite and well-meaning throughout the meeting, but in their clash of priorities, the meeting might as well have been held in 2 different languages. I left the meeting depressed and frustrated. But my project, anyways, was soon taking off. Soon my inquiries had spread by word of mouth, and people also began contacting me about the project. I set up rendezvous with people in their favorite locations, usually Brooklyn's busy coffee shops, smoky hookah cafes, quiet mosques, noisy youth centers, hectic diners. I would describe my project and ask for help, and everyone I approached was interested in telling me his or her story, and I felt encouraged by their generosity. Before long, I had the stories I needed and wanted. Nevertheless, there are gaps, countless other people I did not include, and I make no claim that I touch on every detail of Arab American life. Over the course of writing, I heard about many other incidents that happened to people, including the young Syrian-American medical student who was detained at an airport, a procedure that has now become a sad routine, commonly known as flying while Muslim. In the community, they call it flying while Muslim. Another is a Palestinian-American firefighter who wanted to climb the fire department's ladder of promotion. The study material he needed for his exam is expensive, so he purchased a cheaper copy from an outside vendor online. Instead of finding the book in the mail, however, he received a visit to his home. 2 investigators from the Joint Terrorism Task Force wanted to know why a man with an Arab name was interested in a book about fires. "You didn't check to see if I'm a firefighter?" he asked them in frustration. But the loudest silence here in my book concerns those young Arabs, a minority, who have abandoned their ethnic roots or religion either out of shame or fear or both. They have changed their names and try to pass as other than Arab, Latino most often. Right? So they try to say, well, I'm not Arab, I'm Spanish. Right? So there's something interesting in American culture if you try to pass as another minority, and that makes your life easier. I find that very interesting. Perhaps it is fitting that the biography of an ex-Arab man or woman is present here only by its absence. I don't talk about that here. But let me now tell you about the stories that I do talk about in the book. Stories that are, in the end, very American stories about race, religion, and civil rights, and about how the pressures of domestic life and foreign policy push on these lives. They include the story of Akram, a young Palestinian-American whose father owns his own grocery store in East Flatbush, Brooklyn. Do you know, who's been to New York City here before? How many of you have been to New York? A few, yeah. So do you know in New York City they have a lot of little corner stores, right? They're usually independently owned in New York. They're like the GS25 here, but they're independently owned, right? And New York has a very ethnically segmented economy. So there are two different ethnic groups that tend to dominate owning these stores. One is Arab Americans, and the other, Korean Americans, right? So the stores almost always, something like 95% of these stores are either Arab American or Korean American in the United States, in New York City. And these stores usually are in the poor neighborhoods, right? Or so oftentimes they're in the poor neighborhoods. Because the big conglomerates, the big rich companies, they don't want to set up their stores in the poor neighborhoods. Insurance is too high or for whatever reason, right? So these other groups come in and then they function as intermediaries then between these two, between the conglomerates and the poor neighborhoods, right? So there's a term for that in sociology. It's called middleman minority. It's one minority doing the work of a conglomerate and serving another minority. So sometimes they can be Korean, sometimes they can be Arab. And they're often in African-American neighborhoods in New York City. So, since that's a big part of Arab American life, it became really important for me to think about a story that's based about the story. So I know a man named Akram, and his family came from the West Bank, from Palestine. Years ago, in the early 70s, his father came with nothing in his pocket. He was very poor. So all he did was work in other people's stores, and so he could save enough money to buy his own store. And he eventually did. And Akram grew up working in this store. It is classic American dream. His father came with nothing. He now owns a store that has put Akram and his family through college and et cetera, right? This is the American dream. After 9/11, life became a lot harder for Akram. So things became really difficult, and he wanted to know, is this what my future is going to be? There was a lot of conflict in the store. His store, there was a lot of conflict in different stores around the city. Some of the stores were even burnt in the Bronx, right? His store was unique because they have a good relationship with the community where they are. And so a lot of people would come in and they would say, everything okay? No trouble here, right? And so that was actually really nice, a nice thing to hear about his store. But there was one guy, Walter, who was very opposed to Akram and his family's store. And Walter decided to have a picket line of one, saying boycott this store because of what happened on September 11th, etc. So one of the interesting things for me is that what happened with Akram is that he and his friends, I would start hanging out a lot with him and his friends. I would go to the store. I would be at the store so often the regular customers thought that I was working at the store, that I was part of the family. They would ask me, where's the butter? Things like that. Right? And so I would then, I discovered that when Akram was free with his friends, they would go to these hookah cafes and they would sit around and talk. And what did they talk about? They talked about leaving the United States. And where did they want to go? Dubai. So suddenly, their fathers came with the American dream in mind. And now the younger generation has a new dream of escape. And I call that the Arab-American dream. This idea of, well, now life is getting harder here, so maybe we can go somewhere else, where it'll be easier for us, and we can learn something about ourselves in a place like Dubai. It might be a myth. Dubai might be, not like that at all. But to me, that was interesting that they had that idea. So that was one story. Another story is the story of Rasha. Rasha is, she was, at the time of September 11, she was 19 years old. Okay? And out of those 19 years, she had spent 14 of them in the United States. Those other 5 in Syria. She's Syrian American. Syria. Now, Syria has a very difficult political establishment. So her father and her family came, when Rasha was about 5 years old, to the United States on tourist visas. And as soon as they landed, they applied for refugee status, for asylum. But if you know how the law works in the United States, it can take a really long time before these claims are heard. And her situation was that it took a really, really, really long time for multiple reasons. So out of those 14 years she lived in the United States, she was not 100% legal. She wasn't 100% illegal either, because they had applied with the government. So they were in between, they were in this gray zone, which is usually fine. But after September 11, it made her vulnerable, right? So one night, about 6 months after September 11th, Rasha is just asleep in her bed. Her sister and her share a room. And Rasha is woken up. There's a woman in a uniform shaking her. Rasha wakes up and she says, what is this? She thinks that someone in her family has died. And the woman says, get up, get up, get up. Go downstairs, get up. She won't tell her what happened. She goes downstairs and there's men with guns all over the house. And her whole family is lined up on the sofa. Her younger brother already in shackles. And Rasha's thinking, what is this? What's going on? And they're told that they're being investigated on suspicion of terrorism, even though it was clear to Rasha that the government knew they hadn't done anything. They take them downtown, they interrogate them each individually, and they showed Rasha pictures, and they told her, asked her questions that said that they knew that what she had done for the last few days, so they'd been following them. But they knew that, Rasha thinks that they knew that there was not anything really to investigate. But because they were not 100% legal, it made them vulnerable to this kind of thing, right? And so what happened next? The family split up, the men from the women. Rasha, her mother, and her sister are sent to a jail in New Jersey. And then they are there with all kinds of other people who have been detained after September 11. And it's also a regular jail, so there are a lot of criminal detainees, criminal inmates there, and immigration detainees together. And Rasha is amazed. She says, how can this happen? I thought that I would only be in prison. This is what I learned in my school in the United States. I would only go to prison if I did something wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. Why am I here? So she gets very, very depressed at first. And then she realizes that she has to try to make a better situation out of her situation. And she gets stronger. Her and her sister become much closer. They protect her mother from that prison kind of culture. And then eventually, after 3 months, they're just let go. And they're allowed to go back. And in fact, Rasa's story is quite common for thousands of people after September 11. And the Justice Department in the United States did their own internal investigation and found that most of the people who were arrested under those kinds of circumstances were held on an average for 89 days, which is almost exactly the same time that Rasha was held. So it's a common experience that I wanted also to document in the book, but one that's not commonly known by most Americans. Although in the Arab American community, it was very well known. Then I also tell the story of Sammy. Sammy is a young Arab American who is going to college, and he thinks college is boring. Not like him here. He says college is boring. He doesn't know what he wants to do. So he decides, one day he gets a phone call from a Marine recruiter. And he says, well, why not? I'm going to join the Marines, join the military, right? So he joins the military, he tells his parents, and his mother's like, oh my God, why did you do that? No. His father's like, good, it'll make a man out of you, right? He goes and he has basic training, and then he comes back, and then he comes back to New York, and he has to go for an overnight bus for what's called Marine combat training, the next stage of his career, military career. But, oh, I did not tell you the date. The day that he boards the bus for his Marine combat training, September 10th, 2001. So it was all before September 11th he joined. You know, if you joined the military before September 11, you didn't really think you were going to go to war. But then, after September 11, you know you are going to war. And so the chapter that I write about him is about him going to Iraq. He actually goes and he fights 2 tours in Iraq. And it's very difficult for him. At first, he describes himself as someone who has very little identification with being Arab. He says, I'm not like those other Arab guys, you know, I don't listen to Arabic music all the time, I don't talk about going home to the Arab world, I only date Puerto Rican girls, you know, this is what he says, right? But then when he goes to Iraq and he's a soldier in the American army, he feels more Arab. And he starts to look at the people he sees there, and he thinks, this is making me uncomfortable. I'm feeling more like I'm connected to these people than my other soldiers who see them as really alien. Right? So suddenly, this idea of this Arabness grows in Iraq. And so he goes back to university, and he wants to join his Arab friends, or the Arab Association, on his college campus. And when he gets there, the rest of the guys in the association, they don't want to have anything to do with him because he fought in the war that they don't believe in. So his is an interesting story about identity. Or there's the story about Yasmin. Yasmin is a young high school student, and when she's religious, she wears the hijab. You know, the hijab covers her hair. But she's very ambitious as well. And Yasmin decided very early on that she wanted to run for student government, right? You have student governments in Korea, I'm assuming, right? She would be like a class president. But she was a freshman in the university, in her high school, so she thought she'd run for secretary. At first she thought, no one's ever going to vote for me because I'm the girl who wears the hijab. Who's going to vote for me? But she decided to do it anyway. She put up all these posters, and then they had the election, and she won. She thought, wow, this is great, right? So then she had, over the summer they had some training, and then she decided that then they were going to start their duties. And one of the first duties that the student government had was to go to the school dances. But Yasmin is religious, so she doesn't want to go to the dances. She thinks that that's not in her religion, so she shouldn't have to go. So then she was talking to people in student government, and she said, oh, I'm not going to the dance. They said, oh, well, you better talk to the COSA, the Coordinator of Student Affairs. He's going to have a problem with that. She's like, why? So she goes and she talks to him, and he says, no, if you have to do everything that the student government does, so it doesn't matter if it's not in your religion as well. You have to respect the fact that it's not in my religion. He says, well, you signed up for this. They have this, butting of heads. So then he says, this is not a good conversation. Bring your father in, right? So then her father comes in the next day, and her father comes armed with a local religious leader. The local religious leader is African American, who's grown up in the United States. And he says, no, she can't go to those dances. I know what happens at those dances, right? So they have this conflict. And so then the school says, no, she has to go. She says, no, etc. So the school eventually forces her to resign her position. So she's no longer secretary. And she feels this great injustice has been done her. And so what does Yasmin do? She spends the next 3 years mustering all the energy that a 15-year-old can to try to fight the school's administration. She goes to the library, she gets books out like Sue the Bastards and Law for Dummies. She tries to fight the school administration, and no one's listening to her, ever. And then she goes to see a movie, I Am Sam. Anyone ever seen that movie? So in that movie, you have Michelle Pfeiffer plays a lawyer who has no interest in anything but herself, right? And who's the actor? It's Sean Penn, yes. So Sean Penn is in the movie, right, playing the father of this woman, the father of this little girl who's, they're trying to take her away from him. And so at one point, Michelle Pfeiffer offers Sean Penn legal services pro bono. And Yasmin had never heard that word before. And in the movie, Sean Penn says pro bono, and she says, yes, I'll do it for free. And Yasmin thinks, pro bono, I have to know this word. So she goes home and she looks it up and she finds a legal organization who will support her against the school. And the lawyer makes a few phone calls, and eventually she's allowed to run again in another election. So she runs for presidency of her school. And then shall I tell you what happens in that election, or? Okay, so I'll tell you what happens. So it becomes a very, very close race, and eventually she wins. So she becomes the president of her school after this whole battle. So it's an interesting story. And then I'll tell you maybe the last one that I'll talk about is Omar. Omar is a young Arab American guy from Brooklyn who was looking for a career in the media. Right? Everybody wants a job. But Omar has a reason for wanting a career. And her name is Nadine. So Nadine has, sweet black waterfall hair and deep button eyes. She's everything Omar could wish for: smart, pretty, fun, Palestinian, and cares about the world and about him. But Omar knows that he'll need a career to ask her father for her hand in marriage, right? And he used to be very optimistic about his prospects until recently, that he would get a job, a career job in the media. Why was he optimistic before? Because Omar, who studied communications at college, he landed an internship with the organization Al Jazeera. Have you heard of this news channel called Al Jazeera? Right? So Omar was actually an intern with Al Jazeera in New York at their UN office. And he loved this job. He thought it was great. He got to meet Kofi Annan, who was the old Secretary General, right? And he got to learn how to do everything about media, like setting up cameras and how to run an interview. And he got to bring Abdul Rahman Fukara, who was the correspondent, to his school and introduce him around. He got to do media research. He really thought he was on the way to becoming a real media figure, right? He learned all kinds of things. He had good letters of recommendation from media professionals. He thought, okay, great. Now I'm going to get a job. So then he sent out his resume. He sent them out to ABC News, CBS, all the big news stations. And he didn't hear anything. And then he sent out another round, even to Fox News, he said. And he didn't hear anything. And then he started to think, uh-oh, maybe it's because they hate Al Jazeera. I thought Al Jazeera was going to make my career, but maybe it's actually hurting me instead. And then he didn't know. He just didn't know whether it was something with his name or whether it was Al Jazeera or something in the culture. But he got really, really worried about employment discrimination. Right? And there's reason for him to be worried about employment discrimination. So I can cite one study. One study is by an organization called the Discrimination Resource Center. And a few years ago, they did this interesting study. They sent around 6,000 resumes that all had about the same qualifications. In the state of California, they sent them to all different people, right? But these were fake resumes. But they had different names attached to them. And they had test marketed the names beforehand so that the names would be ethnically identifiable. So they had fake names, but each name was supposed to indicate a certain ethnicity. Right? And all same qualifications. So they sent them all out and they were waiting to see who would get the best job, who would have the best chance of getting a job with that resume. So you had the best chance of getting a job if your name was, what do you think? Take a guess. Christian? Take a guess. Like Kyungdong Lee? Lee Kyungdong? No. Not in California. No, you had the best chance of getting a job if your name was Heidi Mackenzie. And you had the worst chance of getting a job if your name was Abdul Aziz Mansour. Okay, so people like Omar, they have reason to be a little bit concerned about their prospects. But what I found interesting about Omar and a lot of the guys that I talked to was that they actually don't want to believe that they're being discriminated against. They think that it's there, but they're really worried about it because they still want to believe in the United States. They want to believe in their options. And being discriminated against gives them, they've lost the chance to take control of their lives at that point. So they want to believe that it's their problem, not this outside problem. But they're sort of going back and forth. Is it me or is it outside? Is it me or outside? So I'll just read you how I end Omar's chapter as a conclusion for my talk today. So, and that's where Omar is now, in a place shared with many others like him. A place where you just don't know how much power to attribute to contemporary prejudice. You know it's out there, but that doesn't mean that it has landed on you. And then you start thinking that maybe you've become paranoid. What's maddening is the not knowing. It's like lying in your bed at night and hearing a mosquito buzzing in your ear. You swat at it in the dark, convinced after a while that you have hit the tiny beast. But just when you believe it's gone, the buzzing starts again. After a while, you no longer know if the sound is real or if it's just stuck in your memory. So you lay there, awake and blinking into the night, and knowing that either way, you have lost sleep. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can ask in Korean or in English.
You mentioned examples of discrimination against Arab Americans. And I'm just curious, do you think it is possible to eradicate this discrimination against Arab, and what should be done to get rid of that discrimination?
Yeah. Is it possible to eradicate discrimination against Arab Americans, or really discrimination in general? I guess the question would be, is once you eradicate it against one group, I mean, the easiest way to eradicate it against one group is when a new enemy comes, unfortunately, right? That's why there is a joke among African Americans that the Arabs have taken their burden from them, right? And Arab Americans are saying, come on, when's China going to be the enemy? Right? Let us off the hook. But of course, that's terrible to think in those terms. Rather, the idea should be, how are we not going to have these kinds of suspicions based merely on somebody's look or their ethnicity or any kind of communal belonging that they have that has nothing to do with them personally. They should not be made into a broad category of suspicion. Everybody knows it's wrong, and yet it happens. So how are we going to move beyond? I think in some ways, the easiest, the most obvious answer is the correct answer, which is the more we know more about one another, the harder it is for us to discriminate against each other as a group. So there have been several polls, several studies in the United States that talk about people's feelings about Islam and about Arabs and about Muslims. And then they ask them, do you know any Arabs or Muslims? And the polls, they correlate that the more you know a person who is Arab or Muslim, the harder it is for you to be prejudiced against them. It's not surprising. It's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. And I think that makes it even more important that people make an effort to try to learn about the world outside of their own circle. As the first question was also indicating. I think that's a great point. The other problem with the situation that I was describing, though, is that I think that there's basically two different kinds of discrimination that I find in my book. One, you could call it social or popular discrimination. It's about neighbor to neighbor, people on the street. But the other one is from the government. It's a kind of state repression. It's the state saying, this community is suspicious, so we're going to arrest people in this community. Right? It's about the state saying, we're going to racially profile this group. Right? And that, to my mind, is even more dangerous than neighbor to neighbor. Because when the government does that, it's basically saying to everybody else, that's a rational fear. That's a legitimate fear that you now have of this group of people. And the more you look at it in depth, the more you discover that the state usually does those kinds of things for political theater. They want to make it look like they're doing something. So they do these broad brush strokes. But it's not effective as a way of anti-terrorism. You're stretching out all of your resources against a whole community, when you should be spending very specific few resources where they count. So why would they do it? Because it makes it look like they're doing something. So they become politically enabled by that. They become stronger politically at the expense of this other community. So I think we also have to pay very close attention to politics. When is politics being used to further racism? And I think that it does happen, probably more often than we think.
It is that discrimination have become serious in recent years. I think the discrimination has been existed for a long time in US. And then, is this more serious discrimination in recent years caused by especially 9/11, or is it something that could certainly happen in the near future? I just wondering about.
Something that could happen in the near future?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you that discrimination in the United States exists much before 2001 and continues after 2001. So I'm certainly not trying to say that suddenly there was discrimination where there wasn't before. And that's true even for the Arab and the Muslim community. Although what did happen after September 11 was that it went on a whole new register for the Arab and Muslim community. There was already pre-existing discrimination to this community, but now it became much more widespread. But certainly there has been discrimination against other groups, and there continues to be discrimination against other groups in the United States. There's still a lot of discrimination against black people, for example, in the United States. You know, the levels of income inequality between black people and white people in the United States are now more than they ever have been before, even though you have a black president right now. There are many reasons for discrimination and many manifestations of it. It doesn't just go away. But I think that what I was trying to say was that, you know, what happened in September 11, 2001 is that now you have a new general community of suspicion. So beforehand, people, you know, there were some general feelings of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim feelings among the general population. But by and large, that was about the Arabs and the Muslims who lived outside of the United States. But after September 11, something changed. And it became that nobody before 2001, the average American never thought about Arabs and Muslims in the United States. They had no idea Arabs and Muslims existed in the United States. But after 2001, suddenly everybody has an opinion about the Arabs and the Muslims in the United States. And of course, that opinion then connects to general immigration as well. Right? So there's now, if you follow what's going on in the United States today, there's a mania against immigration. And it has that same kind of paranoia that a lot of the anti-terrorism stuff has as well. So what I was trying to get at in the paper was that there was a brand, what I call the first new community of suspicion after the civil rights era is the Arab American and the Muslim American community. So there's something new, but it's also old at the same time. Yes, right, sure, okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.